Hello, my name is Jonathan Forster and welcome to the Multi-Story Thinking Podcast. I'm an interior designer and educator. My job is to improve quality of life and productivity by helping people to create beautiful and practical spaces to live and work in. The Multi-Story Thinking Podcast takes an educational slant to the interior design world. So sit back, relax as we help unravel the mysteries of interior design.
This week I talked to Tom Lloyd and Luke Pearson from the design agency Pearson Lloyd. The studio works with manufacturers, brands and public bodies to identify and build products, spaces and services that respond to the challenges of the day and enhance our experience of the world. I spoke to Luke and Tom during the COVID lockdown, a couple of weeks before the launch of their new range for Benet. In this episode, we discover how furniture can augment architecture and how to design for leadership spaces, the importance of posture and ergonomics in facilitating types of work, the three-way process of prototype development, and why you should have a stock of cardboard, plywood and sellotape. Thanks for joining me on the Multi-Story Thinking Podcast. We're meeting via Zoom, as is the way these days, and I'd just like to talk to you a bit about what you do, and in particular how that sort of relates to the field of interior design. I'm particularly interested in how your furniture design shapes the way people use spaces, and I'd just be quite interested to whether you've got a philosophy on that, or interior spaces really come to life when furniture is placed there, and that's pretty much what you guys specialise in, I think, alongside lots of other things, but you're well known for furniture design. So it'd be interesting just to hear how you view furniture and its role within spaces. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm sure that does. You're right, Jonathan. We do have, it is a big part of our practice. We've got various little strap lines and ideas that we've been knocking around for 20 years on that. One is the idea of people, place and product, and that the interconnectedness between those three things, if you like. So place, that's the cat. Place is made by the interaction of product and people together. So you're right that we are very interested in that idea, and that we sit somewhere between architecture and interior design, because we're definitely not interior designers, we're definitely not architects, but we do have an interest in that behavioural side of things, and it does manifest itself in very different places, whether it's in urban design or workplace design or transport design or the home. You're always how you set up a space influences and affects the behaviour within it. So I think in principle it is a strong part of our practice.
And that developed when you first started. I know, Tom, you did furniture design, didn't you? Luke, you're more product design background, but you met together at Pentagram, is that correct?
It's a bit further back than that. So Luke actually did a product BA and then went into a furniture postgraduate at the Royal College, and I did the opposite. So I started furniture in Nottingham and it ended up in industrial design.
That's right.
So we kind of had this interest in somehow bridging between those two things. We were always a bit satisfied in the polarity of one course or another at that time. And that's so we met at the Royal College kind of in the corridors, and then we went off for 3 or 4 years I think, and worked in separate practices before we came back to set up in 97.
And the role of furniture in space, I mean, I've always been excited about that, what you can do with a space once you start using bits of furniture. You mentioned the different contexts. What did you set out designing with the first projects that you were working on together?
Well, funnily enough, Tom had at Pentagram, after the RCA, Tom went off to work at Pentagram and did a lot of work on interiors with Daniel File. I did no work on interiors, really to speak of, apart from work on Ross Lovegrove's house. But I was designing all the furniture for the spaces. When we started, we got some work designing the interiors for Duffer of St George. So Tom was sort of leading that because he'd got retail experience with Daniel, and I felt sort of ill-equipped, really. But at the same time, we were doing furniture systems for Knoll the same year, which was kind of we thrown in at the deep end. And I think I was amazed how actually the considerations for the architectural space were in a way no different to the considerations I was thinking of as a pure furniture designer, in the sense that it's all about what you can facilitate for the end user. And then the furniture obviously is always linked to the architecture in terms of its placement. So generally you're thinking about, is it a standalone piece of furniture? Is it a piece of furniture that goes against the wall? What's the proximity to other pieces of furniture that then facilitate it, for example, an occasional table? Actually, you just extend that boundary out a bit and it starts to connect with the architecture. So we then started, in a way, describing the work that we did as sort of sub-architectural. It wasn't interior design, because Tom definitely didn't want to be described as doing interior design. So we started describing a sort of methodology where the furniture was building the architectural space, the functionality. So quite a lot of it would be built-in furniture, which effectively is working like architecture. And then we would sort of cascade down to independent freestanding pieces. And in a way, I think for me, I can't speak for Tom, but it was a way of which I could step into the world of dealing with space without taking on the responsibility of the interior design. So I was working within the bounds of what I was comfortable with, which is what furniture does to facilitate functionality. But I think over the years, and just the last year, Tom and I have been sort of redescribing the work that we do, and we've sort of come up with this term, which is about intelligent spaces. We did a new business sort of users room for IHG hotels, which has become a sort of standard, which has got an innovative layout. We've obviously been working for aviation for a number of years. And actually, it's with all those interiors, we've been using furniture to augment the architecture and then be sort of fluid into the interior design. So I think it's from the earliest moments we were doing that, we just never quite articulated it as interior design, and we probably wouldn't want to.
It's more of an approach to situate your products within the user's experience of the space.
Yes, because at the end of the day, when you walk into a space, you're aware of the boundaries and you're aware of the light and the sound, but actually your real physical interaction is nearly always with the furniture elements.
You've been employed by lots of different companies and you've created some products that have lasted for years. And I'm thinking of the Parks range, which I think last year was in its 10th year. Is that correct?
That's
that
right,
was something that I remember specifying the Taguna and some various bits of your other elements for a project with ACCA, who are some accountants up in Glasgow, for some breakout spaces right at the start of that. I guess it would have been 2010 or 11. But that's been linked with the whole agile workspace, activity-based working movement, those types of spaces. But that must have been quite a new concept, was it, when you first developed that?
It was. We were originally asked in 2007 by Ben Ater. They gave us a brief of new meeting environments. And at that point, we were still sitting in the paradigm of kind of desking areas, formal meeting rooms, and sort of a bit of breakout. But usually it was a sort of Barcelona chair, and it was never used. And we sort of peeled back to that, to really what were the needs? Why would you need to? How would you work away from your desk in an environment that wasn't a formal space? So that was one of the first drivers. And we kind of realised that if you break down an office building, you've got the shell and core, and then you've got all your partitions of the defined spaces that have defined functions. And I think the jump we made is starting to use furniture to really articulate the architectural presence of that function, whether it was privacy or acoustics. That's probably two of the main things that Parks delivered. It sort of took it away from the partitioning culture of office furniture, and by embedding those functions into the furniture itself, it then gave us a whole new series of typologies to play with. And there were a few examples the alcove sofa from Vitra, from the Brulex, was one that was pre that. But no one had really collected it together with a real workplace strategy to say this is performative spaces. It's about still being productive. It's not just a place to go and get a coffee. It's how do you integrate technology? How do you integrate notions of privacy and notions of sort of communal collaborative work? So looking back on it, I think we took, in a nice innocent way, which is always the best, we took a few jumps into the unknown, and Bene were very supportive of putting into production a full collection of furniture that where they really didn't know where it would land. And we know the last 10 years has been dominated by collaboration, by colour, by lots of textile, by acoustics. So the sort of makeup of an office project is now always has a collaborative element. Now we're not the only owners of that, but it's nice that we were there at the beginning, helping to sort of shape that.
Was that led by Bene? Did they have the insight, or was this some sort of thing that developed through the design process and evolved?
We had the insight, I think, on that. When we started, and interesting, I was just going to add to Tom's point, if I may. The alcove thing was interesting because, as Tom was saying, there were a few clues of what was happening. And what we did with parks, and we'd started doing this research sort of prior to parks. In fact, we'd been working on a few research projects for about 18 months beforehand, which were about the use of space and how, what did people need in spaces. And we'd been designing a lot of breakout furniture. The original brief was a little bit more skewed towards breakout furniture. And actually, the alcove is, in a way, a traditional sofa setting. It's quite low, it's quite deep, it's loungy. It's not really conducive to laptop work, for example, or putting a meeting table in front. So some of the observations we made were we had some very early sketches which were about the ergonomics, the posture in relation to function. In other words, what postures make you deliver what kind of interaction with people and facilitate what kind of work. So the diner, for example, which has got a similar format to alcove. It's two sort of sofas that sit to each other, in front of each other, is actually much closer to the American diner, where a bunch of people huddle in front of a bench, and then there's a table height in front of them so that they can eat. Now, it was specifically designed, the seats were high, they were upright, quite vertical, quite hard, so that people didn't go into a slumpy lounge posture. And then the 720 table was in front of them so that you could facilitate working together as a table. So actually, an awful lot of the thinking and the ideas were driven out of postural, behavioural needs before we even thought of what the furniture was. So we didn't think, we need a diner, an American diner for this collection. We said that we need to bring 4 to 6 people together, or let's say 2 to 6 people together, in the same way that you do around a table, but deliver privacy for them. What does that look like? And then that we realised was analogous with the American diner, where actually in some of the American diner, you actually have a proper, separation between your neighbours. So a lot of and that was kind of interesting about the process of parks, is a lot of the characters were analogous to things that we'd seen outside of workplace.
But it's bringing them together as like Tom said, as a family that work as a flexible combination that makes it into a system that you can apply in any space. Did you have any idea of how long it was going to last? Is that part of the design process that you're trying to future-proof or maintain the design for a length of time?
No, not really. I mean, at the beginning, it's been an interesting process because at the beginning it established quite a big share of a very small market. And then we thought all the other competitors would jump in and we would just eat away our what we had of parks. But as the years went on, the market for that type of furniture grew, and maybe our share of the market went down a bit, but actually because the size of the cake was much bigger, we've ended up maintaining a very strong part of the market, if you like. And I think now actually Bene feel like it's established itself not quite as a classic, but as a sort of benchmark in terms of quality and in terms of familiarity that architects are very comfortable specifying. And this often happens with products that have been around for a long time. Architects become comfortable and accustomed to what they can expect from a product, and it becomes familiar for them in terms of how they use it and plan with it and help to define it in terms of their projects and their spaces. So we're shocked in a way that we're in its 11th year, and it's still, I think it's its strongest year ever actually in the last couple of years. So we haven't seen any tail off in terms of the sort of its impact in the market.
If I can just add, there was a moment I still remember very clearly. Tom and I were discussing the design in the studio. We built cardboard full-scale mock-ups of all the settings very early on to sort of understand the scale and the feel of it. And then the form language sort of crept into it. And the discussion we had one day, I was talking to Tom and saying, maybe it needs a bit more detail or design or character. And the discussion sort of went along the lines, well, maybe not, because two things. One, if you specified it all together, which has actually happened, we didn't know this would happen, that people have specified a bit of each, all of it. You don't want it too overpowering in a space. Secondarily, each of the characters can be used with other people's product. So we also don't want it too overpowering as a piece of design. And I think in a way, although it's quite memorable, it's also quite simple, which was a very conscious move at the time, not to imbue it with too much of the designer's fingerprint or whim, to actually try and keep it relatively pragmatic and practical. And I think that's also helped, doesn't it, Tom, to produce a sort of calm longevity.
Yes, and it was interesting that at the time we thought the collection might be, the early adopters would be the kind of progressive early millennial kind of, ad agency type, startup-y type people that, but actually it turned out that the early adopters were blue chip. There were organizations who could afford their own consulting, their own workplace consulting, and they understood the value of it. And also they understood that they could really define different types of space across the floor plate of large buildings. And they could sort of repeat and standardize something that was cultural without having to go to lots and lots of suppliers to sort of build up a design language. So that was that was a real surprise for us, how it ended up establishing itself in the market.
I think it's really fascinating to think that this thinking was going on 10 years ago, and yet we are still having those same initial debates with clients about adopting this kind of approach. What are your thoughts on that in terms of how far ahead of the curve, or how long it's taken to catch up? It's not even caught up, has it? I mean, most people are still working in conventional spaces. What do you think about the time it's taken for it to become more acceptable?
I think Luke was mentioning the idea of a pendulum the other day on another conversation, and the problem with our market is it swings. There are these big moves. The bench, for example, has been very dominant for the last 10 years, and we're all realising that it's been a bit shit. It's great for facilities management in terms of density, but it's not great for productivity. Now with COVID, it's really not great for kind of, say, physical distancing. And similarly, the idea of one problem with the whole collaborative agile working movement is it's difficult to give data about productivity and well-being. And so each year, the narrative has shifted slightly in terms of what people are talking about. We went from it's all about collaboration to it's all about concentration to it's all about well-being or biophilia. There are these big themes and movements that run through, the industry. And I think some of our bigger clients like Bene struggle with, do they act as a workplace innovator, or do they want to reflect the needs of what they're being asked to by architects and interior designers? And there's a whole industry of workplace consultation that, in a way, the manufacturers don't want to get ahead of. But what we really enjoy doing is trying to make sense of the market and then push forward with manufacturers and say this is what the next 5 years might look like. And we're just right now at the beginning of a research phase around what does post-COVID workplace look like all of us, because there's a whole open blank canvas of what the workplace might be like in the next 5 to 10 years as a result of where we are now.
There's a huge opportunity there, isn't there? I guess and what the difficulty is not knowing what the rules are going to be. You've started thinking about that. How are you approaching the idea of the uncertainty that we're all facing?
Well, I think, firstly, if we're not in the conversation, we're not in the conversation. So we have to be actively trying to understand what's happening. Everyone has come out with very fast responses, furniture responses to physical distancing, but that's probably a temporary measure. It might be a 3 to 6 months thing until that it'll mature over time. Are we all going to be working at home for the next 2 years? There are these big unknowns in terms of the kind of makeup of work that we're all having to sort of not predict, because we can't predict it, but at least be understanding of,
We were on a call the other day, and I think there is a certain truth to the fact that we were already moving towards the questions that all of us are asking now. We've got a very effective situation with regard to Wi-Fi. We have shared Wi-Fi in many places where you don't even need to log on. Laptops are super powerful and fast. We've got cloud-based servers, which, when we started working, our first project for Knoll was all about how do we get an unbroken Ethernet cable from the server to that table on the other side of the room without using a plug and without taking the tops off. Well, I think most people can't even remember, the difficulty of planning Ethernet cable, because Wi-Fi is completely liberated working. But what it hasn't necessarily done, I don't think it's necessarily liberated people from the office. Clearly, we've got mobile workers and we've got nomadic people, and we've got freelancers who sometimes, by definition, prefer to work outside the office. But we've now been forced to do something which a lot of people were not trusting. In some cases, it's proven that certain types of work need the collaborative face-to-face interaction with body language, pre-meeting body language, post-meeting body language, warm-up coffee, warm-down coffee, all those things which when you press start on a Zoom call, you don't get. But we had a sort of polar separation, which meant that a lot of people that could be remote, working a more free-form, freestyle work style, were bound by the conditions of everybody else. The pendulum idea, yes, I think I love not having 2 hours travel a day. Probably a lot of people are the same, but I also need decompression after the end of the day. So I found myself going for a half an hour walk sometimes so that I can talk to my wife and daughter after work. So I think we're in a gathering moment where not only are we having to face immediate response to home working, but we're also trying to say, okay, what are the good bits here? What are the difficult bits? And what are the bad bits? Because there are some definite bads about it. We had a creative workshop in the studio the other day where Tom and I met up, and there was absolutely no doubt meeting face-to-face facilitated a different type of discussion. And then we had a creative meeting with a couple of senior members of the team, which I just don't know how we'd have done it on a Zoom call. So I think the office I don't think it's going to disappear. I think the frequency, the density, and the need why you're in the office will be evaluated very carefully. And I think we'll get some very, very positive outcomes out of it. So it might allow us to make a much smarter usage, and it might allow us to apply ourselves differently in these different settings. I think there's a very, very big question with regard to the sort of logistics of home working in terms of ergonomics, furniture, loss of space and real estate for the private individual. I think those things are only just being discussed. We're beginning to discuss them with our staff members.
It even challenges the nature of the city. It might solve our transport problems, because if 25% less people need to travel to work,
Indeed,
the fabric of the city changes. So actually the repercussions from one point are sort of exponential, that's even more interesting in a way.
I mean, that's the challenge, isn't it, really, to not see the opportunity in this moment of how we could reshape things. You mentioned the working practices there and getting together with your team, and also the making of the prototypes. How important is the actual physical making of the objects in the design process, albeit whether it's in card or model. That's a strong element of your design process?
Yes, we have. We've never been able to avoid going to full size early, and full size is usually a cardboard and a plywood and a sellotape type of process. You might mirror that with 3D printing or model making of sort of, the physical touch of it, but actually we can't. We have to have workshop space, and we have to be able to rapidly iterate physical models at full size when we're doing our work. So it's usually a three-way process between mocking up that's going on with the manufacturer, cardboard stuff which is going on with ourselves, and then maybe rapid prototyping using 3D printing or other sort of rapid, fast processes of visualizing the actual look and feel of the product. So it becomes a kind of circular process that feeds it. And we've become obsessive with, as well as big gestures like the Taguna for park, we're also very obsessive with 2 or 3 millimeters at a time, for proportional, getting the proportions right and really fighting for those things.
I know that in your current studio, you had some making facilities, and you're just about, I don't know how far through the process you are with the design and build of the new studio, but I was interested in thinking about how your design process has impacted on the way in which that space has been designed to support your business.
Funnily enough, about 3 years ago, we took on a very big piece of work which needed lots of more people. Our team grew. So we had to move our at that time, quite small workshop out of our primary workspace. And we rented a workshop 2 or 3 miles, 2 miles away in Hackney, in East London. And even though it's fine when you've got a dedicated piece of work to do and you need to build something, that's okay. But it really has cut down on our ability to do rapid, quick, spontaneous model making that's really at hand. So that's one of the actual drivers for the development of our new property was to bring back together the different functions of the studio, because we realized we couldn't get away with having a remote workshop. So we've got in a way it's quite classical, but our new building has a mixture of a lot of meetings, quite a lot of collaborative meeting space, quite a lot of studio space where the main team inhabits, a big workshop, and also we're developing a kind of event space, gallery space that we want to try and use as a way of having a conversation with ourselves and with the outside world, as sort of a threshold space, to communicate. We didn't want it all to be hard functional. And clearly we need to make the building work in terms of a post-COVID economy. So luckily it's quite large, so we will be able to bring everyone back when we move in terms of physical space.
You'll just spread them out a little bit, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the workshop, even photography, we've realised we really need probably a full-time photographic area, because with the process of recording and representing the work and archiving the prototyping is an active element of our daily life.
And just in terms of you as a pair of designers and your team, how does the dynamic of that work when you're creating? Do you work together all the time, or does one take a lead or the other? I don't know. What's the dynamic there?
Well, we have 2 quite different strands of work. We have consultancy activities where, for example, in the aviation sector, we might be working on a project where we need 4 or 5 people, and at that point it's very much a team process where you need lots of manpower and lots of heads working at the same time. A lot of furniture is much more intimate than that, and where you might only ever need one designer working with you to help develop the concept. And at that point, probably Luke or I will be leading a particular client relationship, but the other will be diving in and out as the kind of critical friend to sort of help stimulate the conversation. But it's often one of us and one designer that leads or manages a relationship. But you reverse out to have sort of large strategic conversation, and then you dive back in again. Luke and I have put ourselves in a difficult position because we're running a studio of 16 people, which takes a lot of effort, but also we want to be the designers every day. So we're not wanting to let go of the design activity, the design process. And mixing those skills is quite a challenging thing to do.
Has the roles changed at all since you first started? I mean, you've obviously got bigger in terms of people, and I'm guessing the number of projects you're working on. Have you changed in the way that you run the business, or has it evolved in a way that you didn't expect?
At one point, we thought that when we were hiring, we thought we would need people who could do a little bit of everything quite well. So you could almost run a one person all the way through a project, from the research to the conceptualization to the delivery. But actually, we've realized, we often talk about the sort of football team analogy, that everyone has a different set of skills, and they begin to express themselves after 2 or 3 years in the studio. And then they end up taking ownership of a part of the process. So we've now allowed ourselves to have more specialists in the business, with researchers or with particular people who are into aviation or the furniture sector. And that allows us to be a bit more intentional about how we build up a team around a project.
I think, yeah, that's an interesting one, because there's a designer maker that I think Tom and I both were. We both loved the physical act of making. Actually, both of us were quite good at CAD. In the early years, I absolutely loved CAD. And we got early 3D software, which was a struggle. Then we employed a young guy, and I still remember the moment, clearly being naturally good at the CAD. And I enjoyed CAD, but he was naturally good at it. He's now our most senior sort of person, and he just flows through the CAD. And then we employed a young Danish designer, and I'd always loved making. So often I would end up in the workshop over Tom, because I clearly loved getting my hands dirty to the point of inefficiency, as Tom would often point out. But this young Danish guy got into the workshop, and he could do stuff I didn't even know about. So then it became very clear to me, well, we've got somebody who is clearly going to be much better than me at CAD in no time. Got somebody else who's clearly much better at model making than I am. So the idea of the football team is an analogy. Very quick, as soon as we started employing people, whilst we wanted them to be rounded designers, able to do a bit of everything, we did actually start saying, well, this person can do this job and this person could do this, and it does shape the team. I think it's difficult then when you have, because we're quite pluralist, we work in lots of different areas. When you've got a small team, sometimes you find you have a deficit of skills. I think as we've grown, as Tom's saying, that deficit gets mitigated a bit by natural sort of selection and a natural sort of rebalancing that can take place. When you're small, I think you need to be jack of all trades, or you need to be specialist, because you need to say, this is what we do, this is all we can do. And that's still a dilemma, even though we're sort of 16 people, isn't it? 16, 17 people. If we really have those skills for that project.
You need to go more like, Real Madrid and get more squad members. Just roll someone out for 10 minutes once a week.
Or attacker.
Yeah. What would you say you've found yourself being overtaken on specific skills by various members of your team? What are the things that you think define your contribution, each of you, to the business? Where you're strongest, perhaps?
Well, I think we both still drive the creative process in the studio. So I think both of us don't want to be in a position where we're not designing. And for me, that's one of the things that is a challenge with growth, because if you can get in great management that understands the brand and the can second guess decision making within design, which is difficult, then I think it's easy to grow the business. But I think it's very difficult for product and furniture, because actually, unlike architects, you might have 5 people working on a big project. With furniture design, it's generally 1 or 2. So we quite often find we reach capacity in terms of creative direction. And because we both still like being involved in the design process, I think that produces a sort of natural scale.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I've definitely stepped away. I don't do any CAD these days at all. I think everybody in the studio does it better than I do it. So the idea of relearning it, you've got to keep up with the programs. Sketching, basically, my most favourite pursuit is sketching, thinking, and producing ideas. I think the research side also, I think really understanding the market has become a much deeper interest, and the synthesis that comes from understanding the market and the possible changes that are happening, not just sort of what products people are doing, but what is happening in that market that's driving that market. We've moved away as we've got older and more mature and the business has grown. We used to receive a brief to design a chair and then try and design that chair. Now we're quite often looking at companies and discussing what their brief is and why it should be there, and then coming up with the brief. So it starts much earlier, and I think for me that's also a fascinating part of the transition as we get sort of further down our career. And I think definitely experience helps with that, because you've got a broader understanding of what makes companies tick and what makes business tick, which I think is very difficult to have intuitively as a young designer. I think you can have great ideas at any age of your life, but I think experience, if it's channeled intelligently, can be a very powerful tool.
That's a more holistic and strategic view, I guess, is it, on your role within the industry?
Yeah, I think so, probably. But it also is linked to, I think one of the reasons why we work in different territories is because we're interested in doing things we haven't done before. The idea of just doing the same chair brief again and again is not very interesting. I'd like to have a different structural and ergonomic challenge, a different functional challenge. I don't know how Tom feels about that, but difference is interesting.
Yeah, one of the things, we've always loved having a client, which is why we've never designed furniture speculatively and tried to sell it, because we think that the product, a good product, is a reflection of the client's needs, the market needs, the material demands, the factory that they're using, us. There's a lovely soup there. You got to put in lots of ingredients and you get something rich out of it. Designing, just like someone saying, write me a story. Unless I've got a subject matter, I find it difficult to write a story. And I think the same is with the client. It becomes a kind of jigsaw puzzle around, or a game of chess around how you make the most of that relationship. And so figuring out, using those tactical skills and those strategic skills to tease out success is super interesting. I think the other thing over with age, and I'm going to misquote this, but someone was saying to me the other day that good judgment comes from bad judgment. You've got to have made bad judgments many times before you can understand what good judgment is. And as we get older, hopefully we're helping to inform and collaborate and contribute good judgment to our clients about where they should go. I think it's easy to over-innovate with clients who aren't ready, and then the products fail because their brand can't handle it or their technology can't handle it. So we're always wanting to innovate, but only within the boundaries of what the manufacturer or what the client can actually handle. And that's a really interesting part of that process as well.
Apart from dealing with COVID, post-COVID world, do you have any other agendas that you're trying to push, or things that you think are going to become more important?
Furniture and workplace will continue to be a very strong part of what we do, because we're fascinated by it. We love designing furniture. I think doing good in the circular economy, for example, figuring out ways in which we can be intelligent consumers and responsible producers, and promoting a culture of production and consumption that is circular. If we could just contribute to that in the next 5 to 10 years, we would be very happy. And that's an education thing. It's a matter of coaxing along those relationships with manufacturers and trying to understand what that means and the value of those things. Making progress is something we all want to do, I think, as a society. We've got this idea of making as a sort of theme we're running with at the moment in the studio. Designing is an act of making. Sometimes we're trying to make sense of the world. Sometimes we're trying to make progress for the world. And we've realised that we can't our clients aren't our aren't our only clients. The end user is a client, and society is a client. And unless we have a sort of holistic view of the impact of our actions across all those three groups, if you like, stakeholders, then we're failing. So we all have to become much more serious about delivering value at a macro as well as a sort of micro level. We also have to stay interested and after 25 years of and sort of curious. And I think curiosity is something that, if you lose curiosity, your design begins to sort of wither on the vine.
What is it that really inspires you about the process of designing furniture?
I think we've, just like you probably, Jonathan, we've always, when you visit a factory, there's always that lovely tingling feeling of seeing stuff being made. So at a very base level, there's a visceral kind of connection to the process of the act of making. And I think that will never leave us. But of course, as you get older and maybe tireder, your motivations change. And I think for me, they say politics follows art. Eventually we have to go from being creators to being activists about why you're doing things and how you're contributing to the world, and whether we know within the climate crisis or within the post-COVID world, there's going to be lots of challenges. And we have to be a part of the sort of solution making of those things, as well as being sort of ethical consumers. Manufacturing is a tricky thing. If you make something that people cherish, then it's very environmental. Because if something is kept for 10 or 15 or 20 years, the principle of the circular economy is that it never leaves circulation, that energy, that embedded energy. Trying to do that in a responsible and an active way, I think, is something that does motivate us. Certainly motivates me. But you're right. We don't always know what the next bit of inspiration is and why.
We've had a whole load of new constraints dumped on us in the last 2 or 3 months that should keep us busy for a little while.
And I think that's a super interesting. I think innovation and being entrepreneurial right now within the COVID world is not in terms of money making, but just in terms of responding creatively to the challenges that we've been presented with. I think should, as you say, keep us absolutely activated and motivated for a long time. For a start, we have to figure out a way of earning new types of livings, because some of those types will disappear for all of us, and the economy will have to recalibrate itself.
You're back, Luke. Nice to see you again.
Yes, a momentary lapse in bandwidth.
Yeah, this is the challenge we're all faced with of keeping ourselves connected.
Yes, I've probably done half an hour of super important monologue.
Yes, well, couldn't stop Tom talking. That's one thing. We never really got to what Tom's unique skills were. Did you actually mention that, Tom? I can't remember. Are you too modest?
It's not sketching particularly. I don't know. I think it was more about judgment. Actually, those are the things. I think trying to be a good judge of need at any one time, whether it's client need or in the studio. I think that's what I feel like I'm getting better at, but it doesn't always mean it reflects itself well in the process. And we have one theme, which is about the craft of industry, where we talk about the idea that, just like any craft, it takes an awful long time to get good at something. And I think Luke and I have probably become quite good at making the most of production manufacturing techniques to create products that are useful and beautiful and long lasting. And it's quite a sort of Dieter Rams kind of set of principles in a way. That we're always challenging ourselves to use less plastic or less material for the same effect. And that's about really understanding production techniques and then challenging the engineers to sort of respond to that. And that's if you have intelligent space at one end, which is about people and architecture, and then you have the craft of industry at the other end. The meeting point between those two cultures probably is what are two very strong foundations to the practice of the studio. And we're interested in that macro micro kind of set of issues, and making product that sells well, that responds to need, that's progressive and innovative. Just if you can tick various boxes well each time, that's a big set of challenges to succeed on. And the success of product is also our success, because it's how we earn our money. So that's a constant. We're constantly challenging ourselves to find ways of making product that's appropriate for people, and it'll carry on. We're just looking at the education market at the moment in terms of COVID, higher education, university. Maybe we should be talking to you as a case study.
Definitely.
Because actually, there's a huge number of challenges right now in terms of good quality education space to allow people to come back together in the next year, and that sits quite firmly in our kind of sweet spot in terms of thinking. How you respond to those challenges.
Well, I'd be very happy to talk to you about that. Of course, we're looking at students returning in September, all being well. And contemplating how we might set up the spaces to cope with whatever the latest COVID recommendations are. But I think the challenge is to not miss the opportunity to innovate here. That's what we're contemplating, really, is the opportunity to reshape the way we're delivering our teaching and focusing really on what's valuable about the experience from a student's perspective, and then how to facilitate spaces that support that. It's a huge opportunity with not very long until we get thrown back into it. So if we don't do something now or prepare to do something now, we might just get overrun by the sort of short-term measures that are going to inevitably be introduced, and then not have the time to contemplate and readjust. So it would be great to just be able to reinvent how we do stuff. And I think we've got the perfect opportunity now.
I think, and as you say, unless we start now, we will be overrun by events, and we'll be out of control. It'll be like skidding on black ice permanently, not knowing which way to steer the car.
Or we'll adopt scenarios which are just, random compromises, and people will put up with it, which I think actually, funnily enough, when we look at workplace design, a lot of the things that we've adopted are actually compromises. When we first started, the L station was, a new thing, if you remember, Tom, and it was a result of huge computer monitors which had an incredible depth. And the only way you could get them onto an 800 deep desk was by putting them in the corner, and suddenly everybody was on a corner desk. And as soon as we went to flat screen, the corners disappeared because you could put somebody on one axis and then you got the bench. Well, that was a classic case of something driving a setting which maybe isn't the most important thing, and not actually thinking about the user, but just thinking about technology. And we've got the same situation now. In a way, the distancing that this COVID problem produces isn't necessarily, we've got to work out where the good and the bad bits are from it. Yeah. And there will be some good, but we should try and control the bad, mitigate it and design it out. And I think that's what the really interesting thing will be. And if we can then also discover what the good bits might be and enhance and develop them as opportunities. So rather than let them sort of define a new set of parameters, which maybe are just sort of compromised and adopted rather than chosen.
Just thinking about the time it takes to go through that thinking process. You started the Benet discussion in 2007, and the products came to market 2 to 3 years later. Is that the timescale we're looking at, or is there something we can do in a more fast track version?
It was 2 to 3 years, yeah, and that is that's a standard lead time for workplace, whether or not it creates. And the problem is that the embedded energy, you don't want to do it too many times because it's so wasteful. Mm. So there's a strange paradox between speed to respond to change, but also wanting stuff to last a long time, and that's a tricky one to sort of fix.
Might be some very fast responses. I mean, simple things when you're just looking at layout. I think sometimes layout can be changed almost daily. If you don't have system product which all links together, if it's to do with individual items, then quite often the individual items in themselves, I think, may be completely appropriate. It's just the proximity to other things and other people which might have to change, and then the interaction, shared interaction, where you're sharing items. But I think our understanding of, in this particular case, we're still trying to understand how transmission what is the threshold where transmission becomes really risky, and what's the threshold where it's controllable? Nobody would have, even when we had flu every year, none of us would come in from the tube. Most of us don't come from the tube, walk to the toilet and wash our hands the minute we come into the studio. We probably will now adopt that, at least as long as people remember that we're in a high-risk scenario. So, this will change. Some of it will be habit, and then quite quickly we'll accept it as being okay and not particularly compromised. And other things will probably always remain compromised and problematic and expensive. And we're going through that process at the moment of trying to analyse how we get the studio back to work, and what's the density going to look like? Can we use any of the furniture settings as they are, or do we have to shift the spaces around? So it's an interesting challenge at the moment that's very direct and very present for us. And it'll be interesting what conclusions we create for the short, medium and long term out of it.
I think it's quite exciting, really, just to think about the opportunity. If we can just grasp it, that's the challenge I've got down here in Plymouth. It's finding the time to just evaluate it properly.
I think the one thing we've been pushing a lot in the last little while is the idea of user modification, because often it's facilities managers who modify furniture. But if you can make furniture that's absolutely flexible for the user to do it safely and easily, I think that would become, probably where the route to some sort of response is. Where you're not dependent on a sort of systemic infrastructure to make change.
What have you got coming up next then on your schedules?
Well, it's interesting talking about parks, because about the past 3 years we've been working on a new collection for Bene, which has been focused on leadership spaces and management spaces. And we've realised it's been a lingering idea for probably half a dozen years, that actually if we could apply the same thinking to management that we did to normal, core workspace, how would that affect those spaces and those work styles? And most management furniture has been held within a sort of static, status-driven, kind of very, very fixed archetype forever, for probably 100 years. And we've been trying to unpick that as an idea. Also, as new generations of leaders emerge, the oldest millennial is now 38 years old, I think. So millennials are becoming the new leaders, the new managing directors, and they don't want to sit behind a mahogany desk with polished chrome and leather. And so we've been trying to fix that. And actually, we're talking about COVID. It feels like leadership is what organisations all need, great leaders. So it's sort of timely in that sense. Although management is a sort of slightly unfashionable idea, we still need, you still need inspiring and thoughtful leaders and people in positions of responsibility in organisations.
Are we talking about breaking down the hierarchy then, physically, or I suppose, and psychologically there, of how management and leaders are housed within spaces?
We are. And a lot of, there was a very radical step where managers placed themselves right back bang in the middle of the floor plate and said, if this is a democratic landscape, we're just all the same. But actually, those people still they have responsibilities and needs that do demand different types of space, whether it's confidential, whether it's HR issues, whether it's more about focus or privacy. So we've been trying to figure out what is a sort of smart set of functions or set of spaces that might reflect those needs. And it's been a difficult project. That's been a 3-year project. And it's just coming out in July 2020, which is very exciting. And we've realised that in any one day, you might talk to a client 1 minute, a staff member the next hour, then another colleague or a peer. And each one of those three sort of interactions are completely different, because the hierarchy changes. The client, you're sort of facing up in a way. With the staff, it might be more of an HR line management issue. With a peer-to-peer, it's much more on a line. And all those interesting dynamics have played out in coming back to sort of intelligent space and the behaviour. We've been trying to figure out how we can reflect those needs in a new type of behaviours.
Also, the other thing is the idea of leadership. Traditionally, sort of leaders, officers, take an incredibly static format. We can almost predict coming in through the door. You walk forwards, there might be a couple of side chairs in front of a big desk. Behind the desk, there's a bit of a show-off shelving system, and there's a sideboard. Most of that stuff provides very little function. It's a sort of, and it almost, what we sort of felt was it was almost an idea of what a leader's office looked like. But when we actually said, well, what are you doing in it, and what's it doing for you? It's not doing much. Generally, you then find the leader is coming out into other spaces to, as Tom's saying, meet a client, or if they want to do a collaborative bit of creative work with their team, they go out of the space into another space to do it. So we've been looking at the idea of breaking down what leadership means between private thinking and synthesizing content, to receiving information from other people, to brainstorming with other people, or colleagues of an equal level in the organization, to brainstorming with people lower down or higher up. And actually you just like we do, and we have done with parks, we've found that you need different types of settings to facilitate the different types of physical interaction between the different people, but also the different types of work. The leadership spaces also need to facilitate the same kind of density of functionality. So we've tried to build a series of settings, again with sort of a range of characters, which allow you to compose a format that's appropriate to you and your organization. So it has a high degree of adaptability and tunability. And I think that's really interesting, because we've been playing with this idea of natural behavior for quite a long time, and trying to ask the question, well, just because a design has been like this, were the criteria true that defined that, or actually are the criteria quite different, and we've just been living a compromised dream? So it's had a similar sort of thought process to the Genesis, which was trying to understand what the behaviours could be and should be and are needed, and what do you need to put in place to support those behaviours. So the original sort of leadership office was sort of, in a way, not that important to the process. We looked at it from really quite a different perspective. So it's been an interesting, complex challenge, hasn't it, Tom, to try and unravel what that means, given that the culture of most organisations has changed radically over the last 10 years, as we've seen a sort of generational shift. And, even the fact that we can have really quite important meetings over a Skype with people now, and it's, that's a huge shift. So you might be entertaining a Skype call in your office, which might be just as important as sitting two people behind the desk. All these things have to be led into that dynamic.
That sounds really interesting. I think the approach, building it around behaviour and functionality is critical there. But are there any other things that you've drawn into it? I'm just thinking of how the research into parks was looking at lots of things like the meeting huts, and I remember seeing pictures of you guys sitting on the I think it was the Giant's Causeway, as kind of inspiration points. Is there any other things coming in to feed that process?
We do have a couple. We've been looking at this idea of a majlis, which is I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, which is a kind of meeting area that you get in the sort of Gulf region, where you sit round the edge of a room and you don't have a table in the middle. When you see a sort of OPEC meeting on the TV, it tends to be a majlis. A majlis, the translation comes from the word parliament or council. So it's a kind of leadership environment, but you don't, in those regions, you don't have a central table surface. You always have your own small side table or place to put your bag. So we use that as one of the inspirations for a new type of meeting space, which doesn't rely on a central table. which actually we think might be very good for the COVID world, because you're not sharing furniture, literally. We've also worked quite hard on posture, as Luke was mentioning earlier, because we realised that the benefits of sit-stand or of different types of posture in leadership spaces have not really ever emerged. We've even developed a forward tilt on a lounge chair, so that when you come up to do some work in a lounge chair, your seat actually tips forward and puts you into more like sitting on a Pilates ball. It sits you into a kind of active posture. So we're trying to, in a subtle way, allow those people to benefit from all the thinking that's gone on in the last 10 years in the workplace, and point to different types of environment. Because, hotel spaces or aviation spaces, all those, we work wherever we happen to be. We know that now. And so this type of furniture will also migrate into those types of hospitality environments, we think. The collection's called Ports and Parks. So we're looking forward to seeing how that interacts with parks going forward, and helps, establish a slightly different balance to that particular portfolio.
That sounds really exciting. And how have you dealt with the idea of hierarchy? Have you eliminated hierarchy, or is that still something that needs to feature within those elements?
Well, I'll just jump in, Luke. Well, one of the thoughts we had was the idea of the chef's kitchen, if you like. And a chef, Gordon Ramsay sits in the middle of, he's the master, but he's surrounded by his team. He never goes to a sort of private room to do his work. And so we've seen these spaces as just as much collaborative spaces as private spaces, and they can switch function very quickly. So, for example, the main table has got this very discrete standing height mechanism, so you can go up to a standing and it becomes a collaborative space. And that's the moment when you invite people in, and you don't need a guest chair in that sense, because it sort of democratizes the process by standing up. So we've been trying to figure out ways in which the furniture can really reflect the behaviour change very fast. And great leadership is about great collaboration. It's about good listening. It's about all those things. So yes, we are trying to democratise. It's not about hierarchy.
It comes back to our very first discussion where we were talking about sub-architecture. One of the things that defines the classic manager's office is the fact that you go in through a door. It's hermetically sealed. Often there's glass, so people know you're in there, but they don't know what you're talking about. So it's unnerving. You don't want to be called in. So this idea of the democratic environment that Tom was just touching on there, we felt, we might well have to put all these pieces inside a hermetically closed office. But could they also operate in the open plan? Could we define space and give a sense of ownership? In other words, you are in the management space, but actually anybody could come in. We take away the boundaries to try and produce a more egalitarian, softer notion of leadership. It's more welcoming. You could transition across the space. But at the same time, just like the executive boardroom, most of the time they're bloody pointless and empty, and it's just real estate being used up for a sort of idea of pomposity. And yet we find that the general population of the office use it because they need a proper meeting space. So we thought, maybe we can, if it's in the open plan, it's almost as if the leader when he's in might be in that space and might call it his, but maybe not. Maybe it's the space where you go for leadership interaction to take place. And that could be people within the mid-strata of leadership, or people at the top, or people lower down who still need to have some degree of leadership between their discussion making. And they don't want to do it on a bench, and they don't particularly want to do it in a breakout area because it doesn't have the right tools. So, in a way, you've got leadership happening at any portion of the organization. Now, obviously, there's a cost parameter that needs to be built into that. But that's what's also interesting about the range, because you can take elements out of it and place those into other scenarios and settings, depending on your need. So there are some parallels. I mean, I think it's probably a theme that runs through a lot of our work, which is to try and generate adaptability where you need adaptability and where you need sort of specificity. Really try and find out what the truth is for that. And really make it accurate. Because if you can't be accurate, make it adaptive. One of the things it's not a nice word to use, but we're kind of very proud about the ports thing, is that the idea of quality was often related to a financial status, rosewood, very plush leather. Actually, I think what Benny have managed to achieve is this incredible level of quality, which actually is, in many of the component bits of componentry, is quite humble. There's a sort of economic refinement to the structures, so we've worked very hard to try to build in every bit of available modern information about what is ecologically sensible into this range. How do we break things apart? Can we use single material as much as possible on a product that's going to be difficult to disassemble? We've also got some interesting new ergonomics in it. So we've been able to build a really high quality into it, which we think is going forward is really valuable to this whole debate. Long-term product, and I think comes back to your question about ports. I think part of it, I think people do appreciate quality. I really do, and I think we're at a moment where there'll be a lot of cost cutting by companies. Buy cheap because we don't know what's going to happen. And I think because of that, actually, this might also be another positive attribute for ports, in that it's a very flexible system, which hopefully people will understand they can use that in different formats, which allows them to change depending on our understanding of workplace. But also it's very high quality. So hopefully it's going to stand the test of time just in terms of its physicality. I think those two attributes are similar to the success of Parks, because Parks' loose fit characteristic allowed you to recompose it, swap bits out, add other people's products into it, not even by the same company. And I really do think that when you build in sort of fixed parameters, you get to a certain point where somebody says, this no longer works for us, we've got to dump it, we've got to find something new. And I think an eclectic, adaptive approach, I really believe, is one that probably has the least chance of being overridden by irrelevance, because you can continue to adapt it.
I was just wondering whether, when you're designing, how do you reach the end point, knowing you've done enough?
That's the age-old problem. Is there's never a fixed point in time. Eventually, you have to say stop. Especially ergonomically, sometimes we do 10 or 12 models of a chair, and you could just do one more, but you have to say, okay, no, that's it. It's the hardest thing of all, is how much salt is in your soup. Too much salt and you fucked it up.
I'd like to thank Luke and Tom for taking the time to speak to me. There's a fascinating insight into the design process and the importance of making, both in the development of prototypes, but also in how furniture contributes to society and the impact it has. The development of products is closely aligned to how people use space and how people interact, and the research that backs up their product development provides a really great start for concept development. I was pleased to hear the importance of prototyping and modelling, both at small scale and at one-to-one. The process of iteration and refinement, something that we encourage at the University of Plymouth, both on our product and furniture design course and the interior design course. If you'd like to find out more about how to be a kick-ass interior designer, have a look at the website links in the notes. I'd like to thank Dave Clark from I Am The How for production support and advice in the setting up of this podcast, Kay Hansen for her planning support and co-hosting role in these and the educational podcasts for the University of Plymouth, and Mark Frith for the music. I'd really like to hear your feedback on the podcast. Leave a comment or get in touch. Next week, I'll be talking to James Mayer from Viaduct. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.